Thank you for the kind presentation. And it sounds good? Yep, great. Yeah, and as Hanne said earlier, the theme of the conference today is Hegelian Marxism. And one of the most important books in this tradition, I think one can say the most important book, is Georg Lukács' History and Class Consciousness. It has been called a groundbreaking manifesto for critical humanist Marxism, and its publication in 1923, one of the few authentic events in the history of Marxism. And with this collection of essays, Lukács clarified the Hegelian roots of Marx thinking and showed how Hegel could be read from a leftist perspective. And the Hegelian Marxism, of which Lukács was one of the founders, was an intellectual movement, especially in Central and Western Europe, that from the interwar period played a prominent role in the political theory and to some extent also in political practice. And besides Lukács, these Hegelian Marxists include Karl Korsch, Herbert Marcuse, Karel Koschik, maybe also Leszek Kolakowski, and in some respect even Slavoj Žižek today. And beside the attempts to find a third path between the social democratic reformism in the West, on the one hand, and the inflexible dogmatism in the USSR, on the other hand, they are all united by their affirmative use of Hegel's philosophy, with the ambition to further develop the Marxist theory in a humanistic direction. And I find it remarkable that Hegel, the most abstract of all thinkers, here is used to formulate a more humanistic Marxism. And another common trait among these Hegelian Marxists is that they all emphasize the dialectical method in the writings of both Hegel and Marx. And all this can be found already in History and Class Consciousness. And in this paper, I will investigate Lukács' Hegelian Marxism, and the aim is to identify, analyze, and to some extent also contextualize his specific form of Marxism, and how he, in that context, used Hegel's philosophy. So what kind of Marxism does History and Class Consciousness advocate? And what role does Hegel play in Lukács' interpretation of Marx and Marxism? These are the two main questions. Unlike many other Hegelian Marxists, Lukács was an idealist thinker affected by Hegel even before he became a Marxist. He came, so to say, to the Marxian materialism from the German idealism, not vice versa. And as a background to History and Class Consciousness, I will therefore say something about his early reception of Hegel, and to the end of the paper I will also examine how Lukács' uses of Hegel gradually changed as he step by step distanced himself from the positions in History and Class Consciousness in favor of a position that was more dogmatic in relation to the Soviet Communist Party. So my paper here will have three parts. The first one on the young pre-Marxist Lukács, and especially then his reading and reception of Hegel and Marx, and the second one on History and Class Consciousness, and then thirdly on Lukács' development after 1923. Yes, and in his early writings, including the seminal essay collection The Soul and Its Form from 1910, Lukács was devoted almost exclusively to literature, drama, and philosophy. He was an aesthetical theorist with a special fondness for the concept of form. And there is something almost Platonic over his early interest in the soul and its form. But he was also strongly influenced by thinkers such as Kant and Simmel. But Hegel still, 1910, played a less prominent role for the young Lukács. But that does not prevent that some Hegelian traits can be discerned already in the soul and its form. And Judith Butler, she has put it this way, I quote, "In a sense that is clearly Hegelian, Lukács maintains not only that the soul requires form in order to be manifest, but also that form requires soul for its animation. Form will be nothing without its substance, and its substance will be nothing without the soul." And in addition, the young Lukács, like many other German philosophers, artists, and writers in the early 20th century, had a deep aversion against the modern Anglo-Saxon civilization that he connected with utilitarianism, liberalism, commercialism, materialism, in contrast to the German culture that stands for higher values such as art, authenticity, spirituality, and humanism. But his disapproval of liberalism at this time did in no way imply that he was a socialist or communist. His criticism was still formulated on the basis of a romantic and politically quite diffuse anti-capitalistic position. Nevertheless, Lukács was already familiar with the writings of Marx, including The Capital, which he read for the first time around 1908. And 3 years later, he wrote, I quote, "The system of socialism and its view of the world Marxism form a synthetic unity, perhaps the most unrelenting and rigorous synthesis since medieval Catholicism." And in many ways, this is a remarkable quote, particularly given that Lukács already during his pre-Marxist period always looked for synthetic and comprehensive explanation. And in that sense, he had a kind of structural readiness for the Marxist view of the world that he would later come to embrace. So it was directly from Hegel, not via Marx, that the young Lukács picked up concepts that even later will be central in his work, for instance, typicality, totality, and world historical. So these concepts are frequently used already in the important book, The Theory of the Novel from 1916, which was his first work that is really based on a Hegelian perspective. And in retrospective, Lukács would claim that this was the first work in the domain of spiritual interpretation in which Hegelian philosophy was concretely applied to aesthetic problems. And the book deals partly with the epic literature in the early Homeric culture and partly with the modern novel. But like Hegel, Lukács also tries to come to terms with and overcome various atomizing tendencies in the contemporary society. But if Hegel had given a harmonizing road to reason and subsequently also to the state, the early Lukács means that it is art and aesthetics that have the ability to overcome the split between the objective and the subjective, between Sein and Solem. But in comparison with the soul and its form, the theory of the novel is more political. It ends with a hope of a less alienated and more spiritual world. And in a certain respect, it is possible to interpret Lukács' communist reversal, which surprised and even shocked many of his friends, and that have continued to puzzle scholars until today, as a logical extension of that he step by step, under impact of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, came to realize that art and aesthetics do not work in response to the most urgent questions in the contemporary society. So to allude on Walter Benjamin's famous formulation, one can say that even before the fascists had aestheticized politics, Lukács chose to politicize aesthetics. And after the October Revolution, and when the Russian Civil War took place, the Hungarian Communist Party was founded in November 1918. After only a month, Lukács became a party member, and Hungary was in this situation in some kind of turmoil, and a whole new kind of social system seemed to be within reach. So something new will be created, which will be radically different from the liberal capitalism that Lukács detested. From now on, the communist was for him a promise of a more free and humane world, and he dedicated himself wholeheartedly in the party. When the Hungarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed in March 1919, he was appointed Deputy People's Commissar for Cultural and Educational Issues in Bela Kun's government. The Republic was not prolonged, however. The Hungarian Revolution was crushed, and Lukács was forced into exile in Vienna. And there he continued to write intensively, now focusing on ideological and political issues. He published a lot of articles in radical magazines such as Die Internationale, Kommunismus, and Rote Fahne. And it was some of these articles that he reworked and republished in History and Class Consciousness, along with some newly written text. And the book from 1923 consists of several essays on history, class consciousness, reification, as well as on the question of historical materialism and the political organization of the party, all interpreted on the basis of a Marxist Hegelian or Hegelian Marxist perspective. Lukács describes the overall ambition of the book as to make us aware of Marxist method, to throw light on it as an unendingly fertile source of solution to otherwise intraceable dilemmas. And with his emphasis on Marx's method, Lukács even stressed the importance of Hegel. With his solid knowledge of Hegel and German idealist, Lukács was able to distinguish and analyze the Hegelian element in Marx thinking. And this understanding of the Hegelian Marx, and for some extent also the Marxian Hegel, was quite new in the 1920s, and in several ways it was also controversial. And in the preface to History and Class Consciousness, Lukács discusses explicit the issue of Hegel's position in Marxism. He recalls some few passages where Marx points out Hegel's importance for his own thinking, as when Marx in a letter wrote that the true law of dialectics was already to be found in Hegel, albeit in mystified form. And Lukács quotes also Marx's warning about the danger of treating the dialectics of Hegel as a dead dog. But according to the author of History of Class Consciousness, that is just the way that Hegel still tends to be treated in Marxism. So what Lukács wants to do in his book is that to rescue the seminal element of Hegel's thought as a vital intellectual force for the contemporary situation. And the crucial element in both the Hegelian and the Marxian philosophy consists thus of the dialectical method. In What is Orthodox Marxism, which is the most programmatic of the essays in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács claims, and I quote here again, Orthodox Marxism does not imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, not the exegesis of a sacred book. On the contrary, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method, that is, the dialectical method. And according to Lukács, orthodox Marxism has merely to do with the dialectical method, which was originally invented by Hegel. And it is primarily for that reason that Hegel occupies such a central place in Lukács' interpretation of Marx and Marxism. besides Marx's own writings, Hegel's logic and Phänomenologie des Geistes are in fact the main background sources of the contemporary Marxists. So in short, it is necessary to go back to Hegel to get an accurate understanding and a more complex understanding of true Marxism. Although, or maybe just because of, Hegel was the first to develop the modern dialectic method, his understanding of this method was in certain respect, it was not unlimited, it was limited. And the same applies for Engels, who, according to Lukács, took over certain shortcomings of Hegel's use of the method. And Lukács writes here, I quote, "The misunderstandings that arise from Engels' account of dialectics can in the main be put down to the fact that Engels, following Hegel's mistaken lead, extended the dialectical method to apply also to nature." So the dialectics of nature that Engels worked out and which at the end of the 19th century was codified into a Marxist dogma was indeed non-Marxian, according to Lukács. So in contrast to most Marxists in the early 20th century, Lukács was keen to stress that Marx's thought was by no means identical with Engels. And in the decades that followed the publication of History and Class Consciousness, and with later representatives of the Hegelian Marxists, such as Marcuse and Kossik, this movement became a key contender of the Marxian-Leninist dogmatism that gradually was developed in the USSR. And against this background, I think it's notable that Lenin did not pose any main target in History and Class Consciousness. On the contrary, the book conveys a positive and very positive image of the Russian leader. Lukács highlights Lenin's importance as a theoretician, not only as a political revolutionary. For both Lukács and Lenin, there is a close connection between theory and practice, and both of them focus on the dialectical method as the key element in Marxism. Beside Lenin, Lukács also emphasized the importance of Rosa Luxemburg. Two of the essays in History and Class Consciousness deal explicitly with Luxemburg. According to Lukács, she, I quote, "alone among Marx's disciples has made a real advance on his life's work in both the content and method of his economic doctrines. She alone has found a way to apply them concretely to the present state of social developments," end quote. Lukács realized the great value of Luxemburg's economic analysis and points out that she, unlike many other contemporary socialists and communists, was in fact a true dialectician with a sophisticated understanding of the concept of totality. Together with Marx and Hegel, it is first and foremost with theoretical help of Lenin and Luxemburg that Lukács in History and Class Consciousness tried to formulate a radical alternative to, on the one hand, Edward Bernstein's reformist line that many social democratic parties around Europe followed during the early 20th century, and on the other hand, the essentially rigid, scientifically influenced Marxism, which is associated with Kautsky and the Second International. Something that unites Bernstein and Kautsky, according to Lukács, is that none of them realize Hegel's influence on Marx and the Hegelian philosophy's significance for contemporary Marxism. On the contrary, both of them, both Bernstein and Kautsky, mean that the Marxian materialism has nothing to do whatsoever with the Hegelian idealism. And this anti-Hegelian position, which in practice means an abandonment of the dialectical method, can in fact be regarded as an example of that many Marxist thinkers have become more and more bourgeoisie and social liberal in the general outlook, according to Lukács. Thus, Lukács criticized the deterministic and economistic side of the Second International. Its leading representatives regard history as a predetermined a natural, law-bound process. Even though Lukács, just as Marx and Hegel, basically have a teleological view of history, he refused to agree that something really crucial in human history can take place automatically, especially the transition from a capitalistic to a communistic social system. Lukács means that it is the proletariat that provides the link to the future communist society. Only the working class may now act as a genuine revolutionary collective subject. In fact, in history and class consciousness, the proletariat occupies nearly the same position as the world spirit plays in Hegel's Phenomenologie, a substance that is also a subject. But in order to fulfill its highest destiny, the proletariat must first be made conscious, just like the spirit in Hegel's philosophy. Lukács' strong emphasis on consciousness can in itself be seen as another part of the legacy of Hegel and German idealism. Consciousness is for Lukács about something more than merely having knowledge about something. Consciousness is not external to the object, but is a part of the object, and it also changes the object. So the moment when the proletariat becomes consciousness of itself as a class, it is also transformed. Only then will it be a revolutionary subject. So class consciousness is this respect directly related to political praxis. Thus, class consciousness constitutes a precondition for the communist revolution. It is the subjective element that is necessary as a supplement to the objective historical laws of development that Marx discerned. And here we have a dynamic interaction between the subjective and the objective in line with the dialectical method. The most advanced part of the proletariat, together with radical intellectuals, constitute the political avant-garde, and they are the central element in the Communist Party. And the question of how the proletariat and the party will be organized is not only a technical matter, according to Lukács, but it is one of the most important intellectual questions of the revolution. When Lukács claims that the intellectual and political avant-garde, the party, is the forerunners of the new communist society, he is clearly influenced by Lenin. But also here he gave his great recognition to Rosa Luxemburg, although he said that she actually overestimated the value of the proletarian spontaneous mass action and underestimated the importance of conscious organizational work that Lenin stressed. The big challenge, Lukács says, is to find a middle way and an interaction between spontaneity and conscious control. And this is an intermediate standpoint, in some way a negation of the negation between the position of Luxemburg and the negation of Lenin, even if Lukács' criticism of Luxemburg is sharper than the one he directs against Lenin. But the main point is that even if history and class consciousness stands closer to Lenin than to Luxemburg, it is the combination of their theories together with the dominant Hegelian influence that make the work so fascinating and also so original in the history of Marxism. Yes, and after the publication of History and Class Consciousness in 1923, Lukács' thinking became gradually more consistent, but also in many ways less complex. At least partly this has to do with the fact that he became more loyal to the Soviet Communist Party, at the same time as this party became more and more dogmatic. When History and Class Consciousness was published, Lenin's theory of capitalism, imperialism, the party and the revolution had not yet been codified into dogmas, but that occurred soon after Lenin's death in 1924. And quickly after Lenin's death, Lukács wrote a short book about him, Lenin, a study of the unity of his thought. And even here, Lukács stressed the importance of the dialectics. in that Lenin is said to represent a new phase in the development of the materialistic dialectics. I quote, Lenin not only re-established the purity of Marxist doctrine after decades of decline and distortion by vulgar Marxism, but he developed, concretized, and matured the method itself. And despite Lukács' homage to Lenin, he will soon become the subject of a harsh criticism from Soviet communist intellectuals. His Hegelian interpretation of Marx and history in class consciousness appeared to be too controversial to get passed unnoticed. And the criticism of Lukács was performed by, among other, the Russian philosopher Burman, who Elena Mareva mentioned in her presentation, and the Hungarian philosopher Laszlo Rudas. Burman and Rudas turned against what they called Lukács' revisionism, including his criticism of Engels, his highlighting of Luxemburg's importance, and what they regarded as a general subjectivism in history and class consciousness. For a very long time, it was thought that Lukács never answered on this criticism, and that he instead quietly chose to distance himself from many of his previous positions. And when a new German edition of History and Class Consciousness was published in 1968, Lukács emphasized in a newly written preface that he now regarded much in the book as incorrect and reprehensible. Even before this, he had, for instance, renounced his critical treatment of Engels' Dialectics of Nature. And on the whole, the later Lukács very seldom criticizes Engels, but speaks of him almost in positive terms. And this is just one example that Lukács from the late 20s onwards did what he could to be faithful to the Soviet communist dogmatism with its codification of the Holy Trinity of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But after Lukács' death, when the previous secret archives in the former state communist countries was opened after the fall of the USSR, a previously unknown response to Burman and Rudas' criticism was found in Moscow. In this text, which was written in 1925 or 26, Lukács defends history and class consciousness at the same time as he presents himself as not only an orthodox Marxist, but also an orthodox Leninist. He now described the purpose of history and class consciousness as follows, I quote, to demonstrate that the organization and tactics of Bolshevism are the only possible consequence of Marxism. To prove that, if necessary, the problems of Bolshevism follow logically, that is to say logically in a dialectical sense, from the method of materialistic dialectics as implemented by its founders. And given the fact that the dogmatization of Leninism had gone much further in 1925 or 26 than when History and Class Consciousness was published just a few years earlier, it seems not so strange that Lukács here portrays Lenin as the most obvious authority beside Marx and Engels. Also in other ways, the new book is even more Leninist than History and Class Consciousness. While the view of the party was somewhat ambivalent in the book for 1923, Lukács now clearly defends Lenin's understanding of the party instead of Luxemburg's. And in the later document, Luxemburg is mentioned only on a few occasions and then mainly negative. And in comparison with History and Class Consciousness, Lukács here in some degree also downplay Hegel's role for Marx, but at the same time he's keen to make it clear that the Hegelian thought is fully compatible with the Marxist-Leninism that is prescribed from Moscow. And during most of the 1930s, Lukács lived and worked in Moscow. The Soviet Union's totalitarian development under Stalin's leadership made it increasingly difficult to openly discuss political issues. And even Lukács chose to leave the political theory and practice in favor for aesthetics. And the primary goal for Lukács was now, as George Lichtheim highlights, to develop a theory of aesthetics which will do for the world of East European socialism what German idealism in general, and Hegel in particular, had done for the bourgeoisie world. To have such claims to formulate an alternative socialistic and communistic aesthetics, Lukács' literary and cultural preferences appear strikingly traditional. Just as he had done during his pre-Marxist period, he still praised realistic authors such as Goethe, Balzac, Tolstoy, Thomas Mann. And the ideal of totality, universality, and harmony that still guided his aesthetical analysis made it impossible for him to appreciate the most kind of modernistic art and literature, including writings such as Kafka, Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. And during his time in Moscow, Lukács also wrote a study on Hegel with the title The Young Hegel, which was completed in 1938 but not published until after the Second World War. And if the reading of Marx had been Hegelian in the book from 1923, History and Class Consciousness, Lukács now make a Marxian historical materialistic interpretation of Hegel's philosophy. And in comparison with History and Class Consciousness, the new study is less essayistic and more traditionally academic. On the whole, the work is solid, even if some of the book's theses certainly seem less convincing, not least the claim that the young Hegel's teleological period was only a reactionary myth, which Lukács claims. However, the main argument in the young Hegel, I think by myself, is forceful, namely that Hegel was the only one of the German idealist philosophers who took equally strong impression of the Industrial Revolution in England and the political revolution in France, and that his dialectical method was developed in an attempt to understand and conceptualize this dual revolution. In both the young Hegel and in the later highly polemical Destruction of Reason, which was published in 1954, Lukács argues that Hegel was essentially a rational thinker who forcefully turned against the emotionally irrationalism of Romanticism. Thus, Lukács challenged the image of the young Hegel as a conservative thinker that had been established in the German-speaking philosophy in the early 20th century. This, according to Lukács' reactionary interpretation, was put forward by, among others, Wilhelm Dilthey in his study Die Jugendgeschichte Hegel. Dilthey and other traditional scholars present Hegel, Lukács says, as a forerunner of Bismarck, and the Hegelian philosophy, cleansed from all dialectics, became a philosophy of preservation of German backwardness, a synthesis of all reactionary tendencies. In Destruction of Reason, Lukács presents Hegel as an alternative to a broad range of irrational thinkers, from Schelling over Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard to Nietzsche and the early 20th century's Lebensphilosophen, who all paved the way for fascism, according to Lukács. This means that both in the 1930s, when he wrote The Young Hegel, and during the Cold War, when Destruction of Reason was published, Lukács used Hegel as a partner, maybe a brother in arms, in the communist struggle against the irrationalism, which had resumed its clearest expression in Italian fascism and German Nazism, but which also characterized the contemporary capitalism. So it was in high degree Lukács who constructed this strongly politicized image of Hegel as an opponent not only to irrationalism but by extension also to modern fascism. One can therefore conclude that Lukács consistently used Hegel for his own communist purposes. At the same time, he objects to the reactionary form of Hegelianism as examples of misreadings and abuse of the Hegelian philosophy. Meanwhile, even Lukács had to admit that Lukács' thinking is so complex that it can be interpreted in many different ways. In addition, it deserves to be noted that Lukács, throughout his work, continued to defend not only Hegel's philosophy, but many other things that he associated with German idealism and the classical humanistic culture, with special emphasis on authors from Lessing, Schiller, and Goethe to Thomas Mann. And in his later career, Lukács defends and tried to bring the constructive element of the humanistic culture into the Marxist worldview. Thus, both before and after he had become a communist, Lukács was, first and foremost, a humanistic scholar with a strong harmony ideal and a firm belief in the whole man and mankind. And that seems to me that it is a more idealistic than materialistic standpoint. So to summarize, in Lukács' writings from the late 1910s onwards, Hegel and Marx were his main references. He interpreted Marx from a Hegelian perspective, primarily in history and class consciousness, and Hegel from a Marxist and historical materialistic perspective, especially in the young Hegel. Although Hegelianism, even more than Marxism, I would like to say, was a constant in his thinking, it was through his synthesis of these two currents of ideas in history and class consciousness that Lukács left his most significant contribution to the modern history of political ideas. And after the publication of the controversial book in 1923, Lukács' thinking lost much of its complexity as he adapted himself to the quite simplistic form of Marxist-Leninism that came to be mandated in the Stalinist USSR. At the same time, Lukács continued to emphasize the Hegelian philosophy, in particular the significance of the dialectical method, not only as a background source or starting point for Marx, but also as a tool in the current struggle against the capitalistic system, which Lukács always regarded as a curse of humanity. So it was indeed to critically challenge capitalism, to revitalize Marxism, and ultimately to emancipate human beings that Lukács argued that it is necessary to go back to Hegel. Thank you for your attention.